All righty. People, a few more seconds, see if a few more people join us. And then we can start our program. Okay, looks like our numbers may be leveling off now. Okay. Well, then let's get started. My name is Nellie Brown, and I'm director of the Workplace Health and Safety Program, which is part of the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. I'm part of both the ILR Outreach statewide and the Buffalo CoLab. And I'm coming to you today actually from Buffalo, New York. I'm joined today by my colleagues Veronica Moore and Stephanie Olszewski, who will be assisting me. If you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A. We want to make sure that those questions are fed to me during the program. So if you have any concerns, we can deal with them while we're doing our program today. So I'm going to share my screen and begin our topic for today. Okay, so welcome to what is in actuality the last in our current series of health and safety workshops sponsored by our School of Industrial and Labor Relations Worker Institute here at Cornell. Our program today will be on vulnerability analysis, which is part of the process that you would want to go through if you are going to prevent crises in your workplace. Manage them well, head them off, hopefully even turn them into non-events. Now, we're hoping to continue this series and start it up again in the fall. So if you've been joining us, we will no doubt do outreach to you for our next series when we get it launched. But let's dig into our program today and take a look at what we're going to be covering as part of this initial look at how one deals with prevention and managing of crises. Today, we're going to be looking at the characteristics of a crisis. What is it that makes it a crisis? We'll look at how to create a crisis response team, who should be on that team, and why we need such a diversity of points of view. And we're going to be doing vulnerability analysis, anticipating areas of vulnerability. This is a very interactive program today in the sense that I have a number of exercises that I'm going to ask you to do. I think that this will get you started in trying to break the ice and looking at crisis if you've not done anything like this before. Now, when it comes to crisis, let's first of all take a look at what is it that is for a workplace. Well, little definition to get us kicked off. A crisis is when an organization perceives an event as a hazard or threat that, first of all, the organization does not have the resources to cope with, and that has the potential to negatively affect the organization. Now, notice both of the aspects here are important. Many times we have organizations that have faced crises in the past, and they have come through them. They've done a lot of reflection on what worked well and what did not. And as a result, for the future, if they ever face something similarly, they know that they are going to be able to cope and to cope better. So what's going to make a crisis in the future is where this situation may be very different in how it unfolds, or maybe a different kind of event altogether comes about, and the organization truly does not have the resources to cope with this one. It also has to be something that's going to have a very serious adverse consequence or series of consequences. It's going to affect the organization negatively, perhaps devastatingly. So I think I can make a very good argument as to why we want to tackle these things in advance, at least in our imagination and in our planning process, so that we're well prepared for when these things do happen. I've worked with organizations for many, many years on doing this kind of crisis planning and recovery and so forth. And you'd be surprised over the years when I've tried to get some organizations to think about doing something like this. It's amazing what they tell me. Should they plan or not plan? Well, here are some of the responses I get. Well, when organizations say they're not going to plan for something because, after all, when it happens, if it ever does, and it probably never will, so why worry about it? We'll deal with it when it gets here. We'll think on our feet. We'll do fine. And so I did see an interesting rush in planning for crisis right after September 11th, and then interest in it sort of petered out. So when we had the 2009 influenza pandemic, I suggested to a variety of organizations, let's do some more crisis planning, and let's maybe think about pandemics while we're at it, since we're in the middle of one right now. Organizations said to me, no, we don't have to worry about planning for a pandemic because, after all, we have a great scientists, we have a great medical system, we don't have to worry about this. We'll probably develop a vaccine in no time. People will come together over it. They'll do whatever is needed to prevent the diseases from spreading. We'll have great community action and so on. Yes, as we've observed with the current pandemic, it has not necessarily worked the way we thought. Now, if you look at organizations that do plan for crisis, what are the reasons they tend to give? Well, they like to say, look, we've been through things in the past. We know what it's like when you don't plan for stuff. We're not going to go through that again. Or we learned that if we planned for these in advance, we could head some of these things off. We recognized early signs and symptoms, and we just headed these things off, and they became non-events. Or they said, look, things didn't unfold exactly the way we planned, but when they did happen at all, at least we had the skeleton of a plan. We had some basic information on how to deal with the media. We had some statements planned that we could give. We had some backup resources. We had cross-trained a bunch of people. Yes, our planning process wasn't perfect because we didn't have a crystal ball, but at least we came out of this a lot better than if we'd done nothing at all. So we've learned you need to do it. And you need to plan for a lot more things than you've ever experienced in the past, because it's what you don't plan for that bites you. Now, when it comes to crisis management, what I'm asking people to do, and I'm asking you to do today in our program, is really to think about the unthinkable. And this is not an easy thing to do. So I do commend you for coming today to today's program, because this is not easy. And it can make people very uncomfortable. But both managers and employees need to really do this. We need to think about the unthinkable, because this is how we protect our organization. And if you look at how crises have unfolded in the past, the inability to anticipate them is a major factor, not just in their causation, because people couldn't head them off quickly enough, but also in their escalation as well. So I like to push people towards doing this, because the better you can anticipate, the better you can manage. And so if we're willing to really give ourselves up to trying this a bit, It's not so bad when you get into it. I think you'll find that the resulting work product is very useful. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do, part one of our crisis audit, is I'm going to tell you, I'd like you to reflect a bit. Think about some types of human-caused crises that could happen to your organization. Now, the reason why I say a human-caused crisis is because in my experience of doing this for over 3 decades, I have tended to find that organizations are reasonably good at planning for natural disasters. Whatever is the natural disaster that's typical of their area. If their area is prone to snow or ice storms, if it's prone to earthquakes or tornadoes or hurricanes, flooding, whatever it happens to be, people are usually good at doing that. They've been through it enough. They've had enough experience with it. They have some pretty good planning processes in place for those things. But what about things that are caused by human behavior, human activity, and not nice behavior at that? So to get you thinking about these, I'd like you to reflect on the extent of damage such crises could cause. Imagine how bad this could be. What might be the effects of such a crisis? If it happened, how would it affect your workforce, your organization as a whole, its survivability, its profitability, its future? And what about the people who rely on you for whatever it is your organization does, your customers, your clients, your stakeholders? Now, I'm going to ask you to think about 3 and to write them down, because we're going to be working with your little list. And if you can only think of 1 or 2, it doesn't matter. I'm going to push the envelope and get you broadening your look in just a little while. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about 3 potential crises. And I mean crises. In other words, things that your facility truly is not prepared to manage. So take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll start pushing this process a little further. Please keep in mind that I cannot see you raise your hand. So if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A so that Veronica can pass the question on to me. Okay, so we're going to start up again. But I'm sure as you look at your little list that you're going to find it perhaps getting a lot longer as we proceed through this morning's workshop. Okay, so when we think about what a crisis is, what is it about a crisis that makes it so nasty? And maybe we could, as we do crisis planning in the future, we could tackle more of these elements. First of all, typically as a crisis begins to unfold, we are forced to deal with it, in spite of the fact that we have very, very poor amounts of information to really understand what's going on. And if you think about crises that have happened in the past, you can understand why I say insufficient information is a problem. both within an organization and sometimes outside the organization in the media, you find a lot of speculation going on as to what's going on, who caused this, why is this happening to us, what's going on, how bad is it? But the reality is, as we have to deal with it, we do not have anywhere near the amount of information that would be helpful. So we're still struggling to manage in the face of this problem. Now, unfortunately, as crises unfold, they tend to unfold faster and faster. This escalating flow of events catches us up, and we are dragged and pulled along with it. And this can be very difficult to weather, and certainly very difficult to experience as well. So that as this situation unfolds and goes faster and faster, we feel ourselves caught up in a situation where we have a loss of control over how these events move. Now you can see why more pre-planning might be a little helpful here. Now, at the same time that we try to deal with a situation unfolding often very nastily within our organization, we are going to face scrutiny. Organizations tend to not be as closed as they think they are. There will be scrutiny from the outside. It might be just from your customers or stakeholders. It may also, however, be the intense scrutiny that comes from the media. At the same time, the organization faces intense scrutiny from inside. As employees, as a union, if your workforce is organized, people are watching. They're watching to see how the organization is going to respond, or how it is responding, or unfortunately, how it's fumbling. So you can understand that as this situation unfolds, we're caught up in an escalating flow of events, we feel out of control, we're being watched intensely, and we begin to feel ourselves seriously under siege. So situations like this are crises for a reason, actually, as you can see here, for several reasons. So this is tough. And as you can imagine, any time that we could engage in any process which enables us to envision potential crises and look at better preparation strategies would be highly desirable. Now, keep in mind, crisis management is a very good investment in time. Sometimes I am told by organizations who don't want to bother that it's going to take too much time, and what if this situation just never happens? We will have wasted our time planning for it. But you know as well as I do, life is not like that. It's no longer really a question of whether a crisis will happen in an organization. It's really only a matter of when it's going to hit, which type of crisis will actually unfold, and how it will actually occur. So the reality is that anytime we spend some investment in crisis planning, we are really using our resources well. This is a very good choice. And it's not always easy to do this. As humans, we're not very good at taking the long view. We often need a little training and a little help to do this. We're typically a species that tends to look at things in the short term. Even as individuals, we tend to look a lot at things that bring instant gratification rather than long-term help for us. Now, who should really be doing some of this auditing and planning process? Well, I'd like to say the best audits are really done by a team. And by a team, I mean people that bring with them a very, very great diversity in points of view. And I'll give you some good reasons why. I have some examples of that diversity here on this slide. You know, the view of upper management as to what constitutes a crisis may be a very different one from, for example, people who are first-line employees. Well, I just think a few years ago doing a public program on crisis management. And among the attendees were a couple of people from upper management in a very large national banking chain. And as we're going through various crisis scenarios, I said to them, I could imagine that in your organization, robbery would be a big concern for you. I mean, you're a banking firm, actually, with lots of branches across the US. And they said to me, no, we don't think of robbery as a crisis because it's a very familiar situation for us. We have so many branches across the US that on average, we experience basically 3 robberies a day. And I said, yes, from your point of view, I can see why you don't think of it as a crisis. But what if you're a first-line employee? What if you're a bank teller and you're facing the gun? You're facing the robbery note. You're really being held up here, okay? Don't you think that the first-line employee's point of view of whether this is a crisis is very different? And as you can imagine, what we would do to care for these people after a crisis unfolds, it's going to be very different at the front line. Now, keep in mind, people who think of something as a crisis, in a Department of Human Resources, are probably not going to view it the same way as people in your financial department or your legal department. I tend to find in so many workplaces, the points of view of operations staff versus those of maintenance staff are often very, very different. And keep in mind, if you're going to plan for the aftermath of a crisis, because you know as well as I do, the best plans are not going to do prevention 100% of the time, then you're going to want to have people there from your employee assistance program. Again, their point of view and caring for people after crises happen is going to be very important. And therefore, planning for what sorts of needs you might have in advance with this group, it's going to be important too. The view of people from security and health and safety, and of course, the people from public relations. When crises unfold and organizations have to deal with this intense scrutiny from inside and outside, how you handle public relations becomes very important. Keep in mind, the media are going to be right there at your gate, trying to interview employees as they leave. People are caught unawares, and unless they've been told in advance you are not to speak to the media, we have spokespeople who will do that for us. Then who knows what sort of information about your internal operations will get out into the public press and public view. So yes, when it comes to doing crisis planning, diverse points of view become extremely important. Now, what we're going to then ask this team to do is evaluate your organization's vulnerability to crises. So we're going to have them, in essence, do the sort of audit I'm going to run you through today. We began a little bit of it, but I'm going to be pushing it a lot further in 3 more steps today. Now, we're also going to ask this team to then take a look at where you have uncovered your various vulnerabilities and start developing response strategies. Now, as you begin to prioritize which crises you're going to want to work on first, there are really a couple of points of view that are possible here, or you might say a fork in the road. You could decide that the crises you want to do planning for first are those that you would consider the most damaging if they did occur. However, not all organizations view this through the same lens. Some organizations say it's a much better use of my time if, for example, we plan first for those crises that are most likely to occur, even if they are not necessarily the most damaging. Excuse me. So these are decisions we make later when we start doing crisis planning in more detail and are beyond the scope of our program today. Today, we're going to concentrate on making sure you have truly uncovered as much of your vulnerabilities as possible. Now, as our exercises proceed for this morning's workshop, please keep in mind, I'm not going to ask you to contribute information unless you feel comfortable doing it. So much of the time when I do crisis planning types of programming, people are most reluctant to put out into the public view where they have envisioned their weaknesses. So I can understand if you might not want to talk about some of these. It's a very different situation when I do training within an organization and we're free to talk about their vulnerabilities within the organization than when I do a program for diverse groups as, for example, are attending today. Now, when we assign these tasks to the crisis team, the audit is the first thing, naturally, that they're going to do. And then the next step that they're going to do is something we're going to be doing today. And that is, we're going to take a look at 11 different families of crises and see whether or not we have in fact spotted all of our potential vulnerabilities. This is really a bit more of the thinking of the unthinkable, and it's not easy to do, but we're going to try it this morning. Now, in my longer programs where I take people through all kinds of different elements of crisis planning, recovery, and aftermath, and so on, I like to make sure people understand that there's a lot more to this process. For example, when you uncover a vulnerability in a particular crisis family, you view yourself as being vulnerable in this particular area. We then want to explore what sorts of signals would give you an idea that this crisis is beginning. Some crises really do hit like a bolt of lightning, but that's not necessarily true for a lot of them. Oftentimes, there are early signs. It's just that people fail to recognize them. Or, if people do recognize them, that information does not pass up the organizational structure and then become addressed and headed off, as would be the most desirable outcome, turning a crisis, in other words, into a non-event. Think back at September 11th, when we had people from our intelligence agencies get a request sent on to them, in which a flight school had said that some people wanted to come and get lessons on how to fly planes, but they weren't interested in how to take off or land those planes. Yes. Yes, you begin to see why that particular signal, if it had been sent upwards and dealt with, could have made a difference here. And this is where early signs become so useful, to figure out for a particular crisis what those signals might be, and then develop good ways to be aware of them and to make sure they travel upwards in an organization. You know, sometimes people don't want to pass on potential bad news. They think it makes them look bad. Well, you know, if your organization sponsors that type of culture, then you're not going to be able to turn crises into non-events. Now, this next issue, as you might imagine, is a big piece of crisis planning, doing the preparation and prevention as much as we can, particularly looking at those things that we can do in advance and have as little thinking on our feet as possible. Now, one of the big issues to address whenever we plan for crises are ways that we look at a crisis and envision how, for example, lives could be lost or serious damage occur, not just within our organization, but to our stakeholders, perhaps to the environment around our organization, however that might unfold. Please keep in mind that preserving life and containing damage are almost impossible to do in the heat of a crisis. It's the pre-planning that we do that enables these things to actually be done. If you want to preserve life or contain damage, so much of this is really in our advanced planning processes. Now, of course, you know as well as I do that despite the best planning, prevention, and signal detection, crises still happen. We're going to lower their incidence or severity, but we're not going to be able to prevent all of them. So necessarily, part of our prevention process is going to be planning for recovery and business continuity. Now, I like to say to people, you know, if you're going to look at planning for recovery, it's easier to do it a bit using a retrospective point of view. In other words, okay, you're thinking about this particular vulnerability in this crisis family, all right? What do you think the story might be? If it unfolded, what would that scenario look like? Now, envision it's happened. Now, how are you going to recover from it? Keep in mind, recovery means initially looking at the barest elements that'll get you back up on your feet and running with business continuity. It's not the ideal. That may take a lot longer. It's the basics. And finally, whenever a crisis happens to us, We want to learn from it. And learning from crisis is not assigning blame. It's basically looking very objectively. What worked? What didn't work? How can we do better in the future? Okay, so the next step in looking at vulnerability is envisioning the crisis families and seeing whether or not on our little list that we did earlier today, we actually thought about some of these. So let's take a quick look at this list, and then I'm going to have you try a second aspect to our vulnerability analysis. So let's think about these. They could be criminal attacks. Those could be internal or external, and I include here, of course, terrorism. They could be economic attacks, various kinds. Perhaps what for you would be really horrific would be a loss of proprietary information. Think about industrial disasters. What sorts of industries are in the neighborhood of your organization? If they experienced a disaster, how would that affect you? Natural disasters. As I said earlier, most organizations have looked at these, but if you haven't, let's make sure you do that now. Now, what about breaks in equipment? Are there things that are so critical to your operation that these would in fact be a crisis if something happened to one or more of them? Are you facing any type of potential legal crisis? American society, for sure, is very litigious. People will sue on almost anything. And even though they may not succeed, you can still spend a lot of money in the discovery phase and in the early aspects of your defense. What about damage to your reputation or the perception by which your organization is viewed by your stakeholders, the media, your community, and so on? Might this crisis unfold from a human resources or occupational point of view? We'll take a look at some more of those kinds of problems in a little while. Could this be a health crisis? Again, I pushed people on pandemics, but they didn't want to believe me that that could be an issue for their organization. I think we've all learned differently now. And of course, is your organization subject to any type of regulation whatsoever? In which case, could a violation of a regulation be, in fact, truly devastating to your organization? So, the next step in our audit here today, I want you to think about the crises you came up with on your little list earlier. If you didn't come up with 3, I'd be willing to bet that looking through the crisis families is going to get you making a longer list, probably a lot more than 3. But what we're going to ask you to do next is to take whatever you've come up with on your list so far and put them in whatever crisis families you think they belong. So let's look at our list again. Take a look at the crises that you came up with for your organization. Keep in mind, some of them may go in more than one category because the outfall for them, what makes them a very intense crisis, is they may hit you in several areas of vulnerability. So let's not lose track of that, but instead capture those aspects. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do this exercise as well. And let's see what we end up as some work product. So put the crises you've already come up with into whatever families they belong. And if you've come up with some new ideas as a result of these 2 columns here, capture that as well in your notes. Okay, so hold on to that work product because we're going to push it a little further. So what I'm going to ask you to do next is to walk through these with me, and let's explore where these potential vulnerabilities might occur and how they might unfold. And let's see if maybe as we go through this, you find yourself adding to your list or fleshing it out a lot more. So I know that after September 11th, people thought a lot about criminal attacks in terms of terrorism acts. Now, it's possible that your organization may in fact be a potential direct terrorism target. However, for so many organizations, you wouldn't necessarily be a primary target, but you might very well be a secondary one. You may remember after September 11th, we grounded flights, we closed borders, we had a lot of people depending on just-in-time delivery that weren't getting deliveries. So the secondary effects could, in fact, be very serious. But what about other criminal attacks? Is your organization vulnerable to robbery, to sabotage, to embezzlement? Is your organization likely to face one in which people are not getting along very well with each other, where people can, in fact, be disgruntled employees? They might be fired. Are they being treated with any type of bullying or discrimination where they engage in acts of sabotage or arson, simply as a way to get back at how they feel they've been treated unjustly? Criminal attacks could fall into many of these other categories too. But keep in mind, a criminal attack that might shut down your organization, cause you to face various legal challenges, regulatory violations, or even breaks in equipment from sabotage. I mean, by its very nature, the origin of the term itself, sabotage. So think about vulnerability as it could affect you here. Now, what about economic attacks? I know in the past I've done crisis planning for both the public sector and the private sector. One of the interesting comments I've gotten in places that are public sector is that they don't believe themselves to be vulnerable because they say, look, you know, we have a tax base, we're unlikely to face a taxpayer revolt. Our particular department has a dedicated line in taxes, so we will always have money. Sometimes, you know, things don't go up the way you think they go. What had been in the public sector might be privatized. You might face yourself having a taxpayer revolt in a very different way. You might find yourself under an economic attack simply because of a perception. A county some years ago that was in receivership, they had invited me to do some crisis planning for them the previous year. And I took them through this exercise and they said, no, we have a dedicated tax base, so we are not worried about any particular economic problem. All right. Well, the following year, their particular county went into receivership and suddenly all kinds of problems began to crop up. And they invited me to come back and do crisis planning for them again. They wanted to tackle 3 different crises, but one of them was going to be economic attacks. And I said, wait a minute, you wouldn't do this with me last year. Why are you saying you want to do economic attacks this year? And they said, well, you know, our county went into receivership. And I said, yes, but you said you had a dedicated tax base. They said, well, here's the problem. We would go to order chemicals and supplies. But people had, of course, heard that our county was in receivership and they were afraid we wouldn't get paid. We told them, no, we have a dedicated fund. They will always get paid by our department. They didn't believe us. Because we were facing this problem of tight funds, we had a lot of employees in the county put on temporary layoff. And as a result, people got moved around based upon their seniority. Well, a lot of people didn't want to come and work in our department. So they took a lot of sick leave. They took as much vacation time as they could. And as a result, we were short-staffed. Because we couldn't serve the public as well, We got a lot of nasty phone calls where our people and trucks were seen on the road. The citizens would come up and berate our employees. We faced a lot of problems because of this. And because of personnel cutbacks and layoffs, we couldn't get supplies ordered when we needed them. So we would sneak an employee into the purchasing department where there were only 2 people working, and we'd try to put our orders into the top of these people's inboxes. So as this issue unfolded, economic attacks suddenly became front and center to them. So I would say to you, yes, it's time to look at that. If you were to face any particular problem, and it could be legal, regulatory, something else, could you face then an economic attack? Now, I know a lot of people don't think of themselves as being at risk for a loss of proprietary information. They say to me, well, we don't have any patents. It's not like we're worried about that. And I said, well, think about this. Could your computer system be hacked? And if it did, could information about your employees be stolen? Things like social security numbers, credit cards, health information, things that people rely on you to protect. Proprietary information could be access to the control systems of your processes, depending on how those operate. So you could find yourself held for ransom with ransomware, or just shut down altogether, or people from outside managing your process in screwy ways. So this might be a real possibility. And sometimes the loss of proprietary information can take a very different form than you might ever envision. I think back to a crisis planning program I did as a public program, and there was an organization, a social services organization, that attended that program. And they told a very sad story about what had happened to them in the past couple of years. An organization approached them and said, look, we're going after some grant money, and we'd like to partner with you on that. If you share some of your data with us, we will write you into this grant. The social services agency gave them a whole bunch of data. The organization ran with it, but did not write the social services agency into the grant application. So the data was stolen and used. Unfortunately, the social services agency never saw the benefit of that. Now, industrial disasters could, in fact, be quite nasty. I always think about any location, any physical premises where anything happening to a nearby industry could be really a serious problem for you. Would you have to evacuate because a nearby company had a bad release to the atmosphere, a bad spill, or maybe a serious fire or explosion? Maybe an industrial disaster means that a tank truck overturned on the road, its chemicals went down the sewer system, ignited, and now your entire block is on fire. Sometimes industrial disasters take very bizarre forms. So I say to you, what's nearby? Are you near an airport? Do railroad lines or a major highway run by you? Is there anything that could happen here in the way of an accident that could, in fact, impact your organization's location? So it's something to think about. Again, we want to be very creative about this, envision that things can go wrong. And if you had to, for example, evacuate for a while, does that mean that your particular location is going to have to shut down? Can it do any of its services from other sites? Do you have any backups for this? And when you think about the impact of this, I always think about some companies that had offices in the Twin Towers. When the September 11th attack occurred, these organizations said later, yes, they had backup computer systems, backup servers. Unfortunately, their backup servers were located right next to their primary servers, so they lost everything. Now, with natural disasters, again, think about how these might have an impact. Impacts sometimes can be very strange, or they may take a form that people should have foreseen but didn't. I always think about a business that had a lot of outdoor piping. and there was a bad ice storm. Ice slid off the roof of the building and literally sheared a valve off one of their major pipes. Yes, now they're spilling acid into a nearby river. When it comes to natural disasters, things that can affect you can be kind of bizarre. Many processes have tanks in the ground, or processes that depend on natural hydraulics and heights and flows. An earthquake can upset that really easily. When you think about flooding, will a flood take out your primary energy source? What about your secondary energy source? I always think about a disaster that happened with Hurricane Harvey in Texas, where a chemical plant that manufactured very reactive chemicals, I won't go into the details, but very reactive chemicals that needed to be kept refrigerated. The storm knocked out their primary electrical source. Unfortunately, even though they thought they'd planned for major flooding, it still knocked out their secondary energy source. The refrigeration failed, the chemicals became reactive and exploded. I also think about a school that had happened to experience a bad flood. Yes, they had a backup generator that ran on natural gas. The only problem was the backup generator was located in the sub-basement, and the sump pump for the sub-basement was not plugged into the emergency generator. Now, when it comes to breaks in equipment, what do you have that's so critical that you need to think about building in redundancy or backups that perhaps could be shared? Do you have a professional society or organization you belong to where people might have equipment they could lend you in an emergency? So that, in other words, competence comes in from other areas that were unaffected and comes and helps you. Can you, in fact, build in that redundancy now as part of your pre-planning process? And if you do have to go manually when people are used to using computer systems, does your staff know how to run your facility manually? Have you ever done that before? I've taken people through process failure analysis, kinds of scenarios and gotten them to think about ways that they might capture the learning of their older workforce so that as these people retire, we don't lose what they know. Unfortunately, this is one area that people often do not pass on, is how to operate a facility manually, how to trace the lines, how to understand how things really work when you can't do that from a remote location or using computers and microprocessors. Now, what about legal issues? You know, almost anything on this slide could be the subject of litigation, and these could be very expensive. Even being faced with a lawsuit that is totally frivolous could still constitute, for example, an economic attack. When you think about how expensive legal issues can be, what if someone did not pass on the information that they spotted a problem in your process, or they think some of your product was defective or contaminated? Anything that might be the source of future legal headaches, some of which could be really devastating, could even result in your business shutting down. Now, when it comes to reputation and perception, these could, in fact, be issues that are totally false. You know how it is. Stories get out in the media, in the mainstream media, in social media, wherever, and reputation can suffer. Sometimes, however, reputation or perception suffers because organizations shoot themselves in the foot. You know, when you think back to a very famous computer company that made at one time a chip that had a defect in it. Now, that defect was way out in so many decimal places that probably nobody would have really been adversely affected by it other than people using very sophisticated calculations. But in any event, the first thing this company did was to come out and make a public statement saying, yes, our chip is defective, but you know, most of the public who've bought equipment with this chip in it are not going to face a problem. So it's nothing really for the average person to worry about. People screamed. They said, look, we bought a computer with a faulty chip in it. And they really made a big stink about it. So this same company came out with a new approach from their public relations staff, who said, yes, we did make a defective chip, and we're very apologetic about that. We do realize that probably for most people, this would not affect them, but here's what we're going to do. If you believe that you are going to be affected by the defect in this particular chip, we will send you free of charge a replacement chip without the defect. Virtually nobody took them up on that. So yes, how you manage perception is important as well. Now, you know as well as I do that reputations can be ruined on page 1 of the news, and then apologies made by that same media outlet on page 14 in small print. So we understand the reality of this. But once reputation is lost, it can be very difficult to recapture it. Now, when it comes to human resources and occupational, think about this. Would people in your workplace ever complain about being bullied or harassed or discriminated against? Now, keep in mind, people sometimes engage in activities in this nature, and the people affected may file grievances, or they may try to use workers' compensation, experiencing stress, high blood pressure, and so on. But keep in mind, insurance carriers basically will say to you that they do not protect you against deliberate acts, unless you buy insurance for those kinds of deliberate acts. So it's important to think about how you would head off early signs of these. Do you do, in fact, good investigations to find out if these complaints are real or not, and then take the appropriate action against those whose behavior is unacceptable in interacting with others? Now, what about human resources issues where someone you hire engages in false credentialing? People claim to have backgrounds they don't. And you know as well as I do in the media, every once in a while there's a story where someone pretended to be a doctor and got away with it for a while, even though they weren't, or where someone claimed to go to a prestigious university. Yes, they say they graduated from the Sorbonne, but they did not. There are all kinds of possibilities here. And certainly some of these could lead to some fairly large lawsuits. People being discriminated against can make some pretty substantial claims. Those can be serious lawsuits. They could result in some serious economic damage and some damage to your reputation. Let's face it, would people want to work for you if they knew that you treated people so badly? Now, health issues, I think I can make a good argument for why people want to plan for these. I think about pandemics as affecting people both internally and externally in organization. Let's face it, if your workforce is depleted because people are out either sick in the hospital or caregivers, what do you have built in for redundancy in people's skills? Have you done cross-training? What about access to critical information? These people out sick or even have passed away. How do you fill critical areas within your workforce and its special capabilities? So it's something to think about. It's also possible the crisis may be one your organization created. Did you put out a product that was in some way contaminated? Were your people infected and spreading illness elsewhere? Now, finally, regulatory. I think every organization is subject to some types of regulations and some more than others. They might be internal regulations that affect your human resources issues. They might be external ones that involve the environment, air, soil, water. They could be regulations in the safety and health area, such as those of OSHA or other countries or public sector issues. Different states, for example, in the US, have different ways of protecting people who work in the public sector. So these could have some very serious monetary issues. They could have some very serious reputation ones as well. Let's face it, would you want the reputation of an organization that pollutes air, water, and so on? And people claim, wait a minute, we pay taxes to pay for your services or whatever. And you obviously are an organization that doesn't know what you're doing. So hopefully that review of the crisis families got you thinking about more areas of vulnerability or more crisis outcomes than you might have thought of before. Now, I'd also like you to think of two other questions. You know, when we think about Murphy's Law, things always go bad and at the worst possible time. So, as you reflect on some of these issues of crises and vulnerabilities, consider also these two questions. How would your organization manage if more than one of these crises happened at the same time? Also consider how would your organization cope if one or more of these crises occurred at the same time that you're already facing a natural disaster. Okay, so when you reflect on these, envision that some of these, of course, belong in more than one family. Some of your crises you put more than one place, so that in essence, they may be attacks or problems that happen and come at you from several directions at once. So I hope that I've made a very good argument for why envisioning vulnerability is extremely important, because then you can begin to look at early warning signs, you can do your pre-planning, you can imagine what the outfall will be, and then you can also take a look at how you would get back up and running if something like this did happen, and how will you care for your people if a crisis like this occurred. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share at this point and ask if there are any questions, if people would like to ask questions at this point. If you would like to put any comments in. I'm hoping this got you cooking at thinking about areas of vulnerability, because it's where we don't envision that we're vulnerable that the crisis is most likely to hit. So, Veronica, any questions from our audience?
There's nothing right now.
Okay. Well, I'd like to say again, thank you so very much for giving me your attention today. I hope to see you at our series in the future. We're hoping to launch another such series in the fall. You're welcome to get in touch with me if you would like to see a particular topic addressed. I can't promise that I address all topics. I don't necessarily have every area of expertise, but I'm certainly happy to share my expertise where I have it. And I certainly would like to encourage people to indeed plan for crises. This is extremely important, that people think about ways they could be vulnerable. Oh, yes, Veronica can put my email into the chat for you. It's my initials, NJB, and the number 7. So it's njb7@cornell.edu. Or you can put my name, Nellie Brown, into Cornell University's website, and you'll be connected to a lot of my publications. There's also a little paper there that describes crisis management in a little more detail. And hope that you find yourself at one of our future programs as well. Thank you very much for coming today. Bye-bye.